And so she really wanted to know what would be the impact of the EAP at the California community colleges. So just to remind you, the California community college context is quite different. They serve a much more diverse set of students in terms of not just demographics, but in terms of desires to be there, college readiness levels, interest in BA attainment or CTE training, any number. And so no surprise, the rate at which students enter community colleges exempt from needing remediation is much lower than at the CSUs, and we would expect that. And so you'll see they're just in English, they're just slightly over 10% of students who enter community colleges were deemed exempt from needing remediation based on the EAP, and even more conditional exempt, but all much lower than CSU levels, right? So this is our ability to match the CDE data with data from the California Community College Chancellor's Office. And so students, this is in 2009, students who entered community colleges and were backing out their EAP score. So we do several things. I'm only going to give you a few slides here, but we have a couple papers on this. And one of the things we do is we say, okay, well, especially for the colleges who are trying to decide whether to sign on, what they really want to know, because many of them also see themselves as preparing students for the transfer pathway at UC as well, and what they really want to know is this a good assessment, as good as some of the ones we use, homegrown at the community colleges or other published tests like AccuPlacer or Compass or something, and they want to know, does the EAP, what the results that we learn from the EAP, would they tell us what our own assessments tell us? And so what we do is, regardless, we could check this regardless of whether or not they adopt. That is, we can look at a student's EAP test results and look at how they fare when they take community college courses. And in fact, we see that the percent of this is the percent of transferable classes for EAP exempt students. And we see, I can show you lots of different graphs, but the sum of which we see is that this is all students, English exempt, math exempt, and what we see is that the EAP functions quite similarly as an assessment to the other assessments community colleges use in terms of identifying college readiness. Students, when they enter a community college, even if they didn't adopt it, might have to sit and take those developmental placement tests, and it turns out they get placed, they end up in the same kind of destinations in terms of college readiness as they would if they were just using the EAP, which in one of our papers suggests that there could be some improvement of efficiencies, that is, if the colleges did try to adopt the sort of the statewide assessment test and remove that hurdle for students. Okay, that's for that. The other important thing, this is really new work that we're doing, is we want to sort of see, just as part of the broader efforts that community colleges have really been undertaking to reform developmental education course taking, because the rates of developmental course taking at the community colleges are incredibly high. And this is the percent of first-time students who take any kind of developmental, this is English developmental course participation. And I just want to set a context for you to suggest that sometimes at the community colleges, the developmental course taking in English may be multiple layers below college ready. That is, a student may assess so low on their writing that they actually have to take several sequence of courses before they're deemed college ready. And so they really, I think that the community college system is really engaging deeply on how to reform some of this. And so what you have here is a trend, and the nice thing is with the Community College Chancellor's Office data is we have a lot of data from them that this is 1993. So this is a very long trajectory that we can see on English developmental course taking. And all we've done is we've sliced the lines by different types of colleges. Colleges, early adopters, it's about 30-some colleges. There's 112, depending when and how you count, in terms of how many community colleges there are. So these are colleges that adopted the EAP quickly when they were able to. Late adopters, and it's not even that late. I mean, this only came about in 2008. Adopted, and then ones that do not accept the EAP. And so there's several things you can note from this graph. First of all, you're noting that at about the time of this shift in the legislation to include the community colleges, you see a decline for all colleges, right? And so all colleges are experiencing slight declines in developmental course taking around this time. And then again, using some not so fancy but slightly fancy statistics, we kind of back out this temporal trend that you see for all colleges and ask, do those who adopt the EAP see bigger? In other words, are they more reform, or we might call them more reform-oriented campuses, getting bigger changes in developmental course taking? And we do find important differences, statistically significant differences, small, but suggesting that it's not just this trend, but that there was, in fact, some evidence of true reform, that you see that campuses that did this got a bigger bang in terms of drops in developmental course participation. Okay, so there's lots of other work we did on the community college if folks are interested. I mean, I'm going to sort of say that at the end anyway to please be in touch. We're going to have lots of papers on this, but we don't find that the EAP did not dissuade students from applying. This is on all of the unintended consequences of the EAP, potentially unintended consequences. The EAP did not dissuade students from applying to or enrolling at a CSU. We were really concerned when we were getting all these sort of reductions in remediation rates. We're like, great, the program works, but we did really worry that it might work through just resorting students out of college, which we were concerned about. And we've tried this in lots of different ways, and we just find no evidence that it sorted students away from the CSU. We also do not find, and we were hoping it meant that lots more students were taking 12th grade math. We don't, however, find evidence of that. And it's fair to say it's not that they're not taking 12th grade math. We just do not see that the bump, we don't see a bump as a result of getting a signal to stay in math in 12th grade. So that could be for many different reasons. One option is it could be that those students who end up going to CSU just, they're taking 12th grade math anyway. We also could be the fact that when I was in on early meetings on how EAP was functioning in high schools, we also were told by lots of K-12 folks that the sort of signal comes pretty late in 11th grade in terms of course scheduling. So it's not like there's tons of teachers and classes ready to teach pre-calculus or even algebra 2 in 12th grade to suddenly produce a lot more sections. And so that it was hard to imagine, it was going to be much harder to think of sort of really fundamentally changing course offerings in 12th grade at that point in time. And so it also just could be that it's not realized in that way. And we didn't mention, but the reason we were able to do this analysis is because we actually took advantage of data from UC, because the UC does this transcript evaluation surveys. I don't know if folks know about that, but they basically contract with a bunch of high schools to give them information about course taking patterns and A to G eligibility. And so we got data from them to be able it's a representative sample of California high schools, and that's who we were able to do this analysis for. We do see some evidence that the EAP participation in the earlier years, where there was variation in participation, may have benefited high school accountability measures for those who more heavily participated. We also then learned EAP adoption in community colleges is associated with lower rates of developmental course taking. Okay, and then I'm going to end by talking a little bit about what our next steps are. So I've promised Beverly we won't abandon EAP. We're going to check out the long-term outcomes of EAP, which is not just interesting to us, but again, also really interesting to the federal government and for other states that are thinking about this. We don't just want to, we have so much evidence that we get kids in the college door, but then they don't stay. And so we really are trying very hard to work to better understand college persistence and completion. And to the extent that early information about college readiness and the transition to college may impact those longer term outcomes is incredibly important. And so we're going to stay on that, including time to degree. We also are in this college readiness in the era of Common Core and Smarter Balance assessments. And so, of course, I'm super eager to learn what the department and others are thinking about how, EAP 2.0 or Smarter Balance. I don't want to give anyone good or bad credit, but in terms of what it's going to look like down the road. And I think it's going to be really important to think about just both the content of the assessments, but really how it's translated as information. What attracted us to EAP as a policy to understand was that it's a relatively light touch intervention in terms of information to students, and the role of information in students supporting their pathway to college is really important. So it's not just the Smarter Balance assessments and who's going to score and there are going to be lower rates of exemption. It's really how also information is going to be transferred to students about what they can do between whenever they get that signal and when they enter college. And we really care a lot about that. And then finally, like many other systems and states, we don't just kind of hang out with one policy and see if it works. We throw in other policies. And so not long ago, CSU, it's now year 3 of actual adoption, adopted early start. So the board, regents, is it regents? trustees of CSU basically voted to say, hey, we don't like all these high remediation rates. We're going to have students take care of most of these developmental needs before they actually start. They were actually revolutionary, even though Florida's getting all the attention for it, because they also said enough. People just don't look west. I mean, we did it earlier. And so we call that early start. I care a lot about early start. It's really important. We didn't spend any time on it here, but there's a lot of research evidence on the impact of remediation in college, which I didn't talk about here. I've done some, others have done a lot of work on this. And there's not a lot of evidence that students who get a lot of remediation actually, it helps them down the road. And so how we structure the fact that students are, the mismatch there between students entering with real gaps in their college readiness, but then we don't necessarily offer courses in college that help them meet those basic skills, the deficiencies, is really important. And so early start, what makes it interesting is that the 23 campuses kind of have applied this very differently. There are some similarities, but what students were told is that to enter as freshmen, they need to address some of those developmental courses if they required them in the summer. And so some did it through traditional courses that they would come to the CSU in the summer. Some partnered with community colleges. Some were online. Some were hybrid. There are a lot of different options, and it's also just in year 3, so who knows what will come to be. And some are also different levels of credit. So you could do this sometimes in 1 unit, sometimes 3 units. And so there's letting lots of flowers bloom, and we're kind of interested in seeing what that means, both for not just for college readiness once they start, but what it means for their trajectory. Are we going to see students finish more quickly? Are we going to see them persist? Are we going to see them kind of not get what they need developmentally and then sort of drop out? So stay tuned. We're hoping to get that. It's much trickier data-wise because what was nice about EAP is that signal was the same on that cutoff, and it makes researchers really excited when you can sort of take advantage of that. But here it's going to be confounded with lots of different things that campuses are doing, or that campuses may have had were predisposed in terms of thinking about how developmental course taking should look like on their campuses. So then when Early Start came on board, they said, great, well, we always thought we should do it this way. Now there are opportunities to do that. And we want to learn a lot, in this case, not just as much about the effects of Early Start, but also the implementation of Early Start and how campuses see this as different opportunities for addressing developmental course taking. I think that might be it. So here's how to find us. We have lots of papers, and I just want to sort of preview that we are going to put out a summary of all of this work in a PACE policy brief, spring, summer. But we do have lots of academic and policy reports and other kinds of stuff that's already been out. And I don't know how much is actually posted on my website because of, if it's already out in a journal, they don't want you to post it on your website. But I'm happy to email anything that we've already done. So you can find me here, or Jake. He has all this, access to all those same papers. And to stay tuned for people who just would rather read the 6-page version of all of these papers. That will come out as well. So we'll get that out to you guys. But thank you, and we're happy to take questions.
Has anybody thought about looking at the validity of the CSU entry exam itself?
On whether it's a good determination for college readiness?
Yeah, whether it determines college readiness, whether people would pass it and those that don't have that much difference.
Yeah, it's a really good question. Yeah, so I haven't done a straight up validity. I have looked at this, and so if you put, I don't have a whiteboard here, but if you put on the left, let's call the outcome the thing we care about most, which is just completing, let's say probability of finishing CSU, and on the y-axis ELM or EPT, you don't actually, your intuition is right, which is at the cutoff that CSU determines you're ready or not, you don't see any big difference on who's likely to finish. You see students at the very bottom of ELM and EPT compared to those at the very top. Those students differ, kind of like Jake pointed out. Those students differ dramatically. But at the cutoff, where someone has said, this is going to be someone who needs developmental ed and this is someone who doesn't, you actually do not see big differences in the likelihood of completion.
And that could be related to the validity of the test, but it could also be just as related to the fact that remediation does a good job of lifting those students just under the cutoff up to the same level as students above.
Yeah, and how its developmental is
Well,
transferred.
the other question is whether remediation improves students that much, but, when you stop and think about CSU has all kinds of motivations to give the test, and not all of them have to do with getting better prepared students.
Yeah, I mean, there are, and I would put community colleges in this category too. There's like definitely lots of folks, who, not only testing and components to this, but also courses that are many courses on the books you see as well on sort of getting students ready, and there are tons of them, right? And I think it definitely comes up in question whether we even need so many assessments to begin with if they don't necessarily show, and whether whether students who end up in these courses do any better. I think you raise a really good question. I think it's very hard, what I was referring to, the research on remediation, one of the things it shows is that students who are, just miss these cutoffs and end up in basic skills aren't necessarily better served in these courses. And moreover, in places where they either didn't offer them or there was an opportunity for those students to self-select, they did just as well, even if they didn't. It's hard for me. I mean, I didn't evaluate the ELM and EPT specifically for CSU, but I think, these conversations, and maybe Beverly can speak to this, were probably part of the early start discussion. Like, well, if we don't necessarily, know if they fit, but maybe we sort of should move it up at least. I don't know if that was part of the discussion around early start.
Third and final point on that, the early start courses in English might help the students do better in college English. The question is, does college English help the students do anything else better?
Yeah.
I know I mentioned that with personal experience decades ago. College English C, verbal ability extremely high, and took me a while to figure out I needed everything that every English teacher ever taught me. How to write flowery, complicated sentences, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I have a feeling the person sitting next to you will have a lot of opinions around sort of expository writing. I think this has come up. I'm working on a totally separate project with middle school in Sacramento, who's really working on this expository reading and writing early on in terms of middle school students and then into high school. And you're right. I mean, who becomes an English teacher? People who love literature, and they, and for years, English curriculum looked a certain way, and now people in college like me say, we are getting students who don't even know how to write. They can't use evidence, and so I think at CSU faculty did exactly that. They said this isn't the kind of college writing, and so how do we retrain or work with English teachers who love literature to say there's a different kind of writing that your students need to do to be college ready, and that I think has been the big focus.
We'll make sure the students have good enough writing and reading skills for every course except English.
No, yeah. You might.
That's part of the goal of Common Core as well. Are there others with questions? Sasha?
Yes, so I'm trying to formulate this question. I don't quite have it down, but I think we're sort of starting with the premise that remediation is necessary, and not from the assumption that some students who may not be ready might perform just as well if they're thrown into a tougher class. And so, is there any comparison between students who take EAP, go into CSU, find out that they're not ready, so they do some remediation courses with similar population, and then say graduation rates or assistance rates?
Yeah, I mean, you're asking a similar. I mean, I would just say the research based on this is mixed. I have not been able to directly do this with CSU because my data I could do this with the community colleges. It's a different population. With CSU, my data from the chancellor's office is at the term level, so I don't have a course level information. I know if they needed remediation, I know their ELM and EPT scores. I know how they fared. Like, did they? I know if they completed based on a file that CSU chancellor's office collects on. Did a student who was deemed needing remediation, did they complete it? And then I can look at their grades every term, and I can see if they've enrolled, and I can see their major. But I can't tell what English class they took or other classes they took, and whether they did any better. Early start, however, will allow me to do some of this because I can sort of document a student who needed developmental ed at Chico and faced one kind of treatment compared to San Bernardino that faced a different kind of treatment in terms of early start. And that will get at some of this. From the extensive research on remediation, there's been a lot written. I've written a sort of summary of some of the research on remediation. At best, it's mixed. At best, you see slightly students at community colleges, for example, in Ohio, who needed developmental ed compared to those who didn't. Just again at this cutoff, or actually they used a different identification strategy. They find that they slightly were improved in terms of the rates of then transferring to a 4-year. But then similar work in Texas suggests they were no better off. I think, again, all of this has really impacted places like Florida and others that just said if we don't have strong evidence that it improves, then why do we do it? Lots of reform oriented. I think there's a conference next week in Berkeley. Lots of reform around this at the community colleges in math, for example, that continues to be a gatekeeper for transfer level. So, I mean, all I can tell you is that at best the evidence is mixed on this. And I don't know, but just because it's mixed doesn't mean we should completely throw it out either. It's just as dangerous to do that as to sort of, say, let's make everyone have remediation. I mean, I'm not sure that would solve it either. So it's a really important question.
Thank you. So I'm not exactly sure how to phrase my question either, but I've looked at data of EAP, and my interest is primarily in terms of the ethnicity breakdown and how students are faring. And what appeared to me is that African American students consistently scored low. I looked at the scores for over a couple of years, and the difference was so minimal that my question was, well, if 7 years the score remained the same, why aren't we doing something to get this score moving, and why hasn't this raised red flags? Then, in your GPA analysis, you showed that, the difference obviously sometimes is about where the school is, right? So I'm not exactly sure, because I think you're just looking at data and you're looking at the test itself, but has there been sort of use of this data to really sort of make an impactful difference? And in these circumstances, I would think we'd want to address these specific schools and then go backwards to earlier, like junior high.
Yeah. So in our, and you can add to this, I mean, so two things I wanted to respond to. So on the first piece on sort of the racial ethnic differences, it's important to say it's not that they don't, I mean, there are important racial ethnic differences in scores. You saw me in one of those early slides. What we don't find is that the treatment of EAP, that is getting the signal, functioned any differently for African American students than any other student. So that's what I mean by there's sort of no differential effect by race. But you are right to say if we found the effect on mostly students who were just close to meeting college readiness, there are important racial ethnic differences in the probability of being a student in that close to readiness versus not, and those very much are related to race. I'll also just point you to a paper I wrote not long ago that looked at developmental course taking at the community colleges that was actually quite troubling, that suggested that students with very similar developmental course, very similar college readiness based on the CST who entered community colleges, African American students and Latino students were much more likely to be placed in developmental course taking than were whites, and I don't remember Asians directly. But and so, I mean, there's lots to tackle here on racial ethnic differences in developmental course taking, and that is connected to sort of school quality measures, to potentially, testing differences. There's any number of potential explanations. So I just want to say it's not that we've looked at this in other ways. I think here our main point is that the actual signal looks similar for different types by demographics. Do you want to add anything to that?
No, but I do think that your point's a good one. And if you look at the schools, the green school and the red school here, I didn't pull them from nowhere, but they were the first two schools I pulled. I had a pretty good idea of what I'd choose, and I chose a random school from LA USD, is the green line, and I chose a random school from a Bay Area.
Contra Costa County suburb. We didn't pick any high-profile schools.
And it worked out really well for the graph, but also before schools had no idea. High schools had no idea if their students were actually college ready before this. They would send the kids they had kids with a 4.0, and the kids with the 4.0 were going to college, and that was what they knew. But they didn't know if they were taking remedial courses. And what it looks like now is that they are. So if anything, I don't know if anything has been done systematically, but this is an opportunity for that to occur, but that didn't happen before the AP.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, and it just, we don't want to mask racial ethnic differences, which are, I mean, as long as there are students are not equally by race or SES across the state in colleges or in K-12 settings. And so, it's important that in graphs like this, we know that, yes, if you're an African-American student in this state, you're much more likely to be in a school that looks like this than a school that's red. That's the truth. Yeah.
So we looked at some of the early start data, and we saw two things. The students, if they both were placed conditionally by the EAP, and then when you look at early start, students who took early start succeeded through remedial sequence at a slightly greater rate than those who were placed as needing the early start but didn't take it during the summer.
Interesting.
And the second thing is there's a marked difference in the students who took the online one-credit course versus those who took the three-credit face-to-face course in both math and English. And the success rate was almost double for those who took the three-credit face-to-face, which is not surprising.
Yeah, nah.
This is one-credit online, and we're going to essentially suspend it on credit, one-credit online.
Which campus are you at? Is this at a particular campus or is this system-wide? Northridge, sorry, I missed that.
We have a large number of students.
Yeah.
15 to 16
Yeah. Yeah. What's interesting also about that is there's quite a bit of research on what's called summer melt. That is the fact that students plan to go to college and they submit all their forms, and then something happens in the summer, whether it's jobs or other things, and then they don't necessarily show up. So the nice thing, the other sort of way in which early start may make a difference is in getting those 3-unit ones that come to campus, getting them engaged in the campus, especially students who we think are at risk of not persisting, of not doing well, and getting them engaged with the campus earlier and through the summer is another way in which you can. Mm-hmm.
Other questions?
I'm wondering if you thought about how we plan for, with Smarter Balance, the difference in math, where we've had a limited population of students taking the math EAP, and, who were in A through G pattern, Algebra 2 or higher, and now we're going to have that EAP score for all 11th grade, like we do for
Yeah.
English, what that'll do to our placement rates, and how do we analyze the effect of getting that signal for all students?
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, what I loved about the conditional exempt in math in the EAP is that with that letter, it actually gave students a little more information. Whether or not they did it is a whole other thing, but that it was like a mapping, like, okay, and in my sense from talking to CSU faculty about this, it was like, the conditional exempt in math meant that they were ready, that what they didn't want is them to slip, to not have any math in 12th grade. And so I think the same kind of logic could be used here, which is we really need to think about, because the reality is they're going to go down, everything's going to go down, right, with these new assessments. Everybody's going to be less likely to be ready, but especially in something like math, where we can sort of think about, what are, and again, and I hope CSU faculty are involved on this planning part too, but like, what does Common Core math in 12th grade look like in a way that keeps people sort of, ready? And I don't know, and so for that, again, what I liked is that the cutoff was more generous on the conditional ready, because it really was just about sort of holding your place.
But it's going to get so complicated because in English, high school graduation requirement is English enrollment every year.
Yeah.
And so they were all there and they got the signal. In math, it's only 2 years.
Right.
So we're going to have a lot of kids in 11th grade getting a college ready signal who may score conditional.
I thought that, yeah, right. I thought it was 3. It is 3 for high school graduation.
So these kids might
Yeah.
not be in any math in 11th grade. Well, let's say they're just good math kids, but they just
Yeah.
aren't college ready. They haven't thought of themselves as college ready. They get a conditional signal. So it encourages them to take a 12th grade math, but
Yeah.
they're still going to be, it's going to be a lower level 12th grade.
Yeah.
I mean, it's going to be,
Yeah.
take all of this nice longitudinal data.
I know. Tell me about it. Now you're speaking. It's extremely painful, as Jenny here knows. Yeah, it's like, no, not my trend. You're gonna kill it. Yes. Oh, trust me, we're right there with you. We care a lot. Yeah, I mean, I think you raise a really good point. I guess I kind of want to turn to my CD folks on this only because, I mean, so one is it makes me think around sort of basic behavioral econ, which is like if we just know that having 4 years in math is just a good thing, whether it's not just for college readiness, but even for career readiness, you would think that slowly, Kate, the schools will just it should be a default. It should buying into retirement. I think we know from all that sort of behavioral econ, like students, do we really need to give them a choice? I don't know. I'm just throwing it out there. This is not empirics now. It's just kind of, maybe it's just the default is 12th grade math. I don't know. Any thoughts on? Right. Yeah.
Most require 3, and equal numbers only require 2, require 4.
Yeah.
Texas, for God's sake, requires 4.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
Don't talk Texas down to that.
Yeah.
They require all their elementary
Yeah.
take college math to get a
Well, actually, so does CSU. I don't know if people realize that math GE at CSU is much more rigorous than the math GE at UC. Just outing my own institution.
No, we are developing a new accountability system, and there are a lot of things on the table. And one of the things that we're talking about putting into the accountability system is, we would give credit to kids who take math in grade 12.
Yep.
Or take a higher level science course in grade 12. Because we do see that there's a lot of kids who kind of slack off, and
Yeah.
this is my senior year.
Yeah.
This is, let's
They get the
just
signal
coast.
and they don't care.
Yeah, let's just
My
coast.
daughter did that.
So it is part of the discussion that's on the table.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing that I have to throw in here is when we talk about the remedial rates and the levels is that it's really hard, it's really difficult to look at other states and their remedial rates and what happens to ours. The EAP program, this whole early signal, is now the model for the rest of the country. Everybody adopting either Parker Smart or Balance is
Doing
going
this.
to have an 11th grade signal of readiness. It's still going to be very, very hard to compare because our college readiness standards are not the same as others.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
And the only way we have to compare them is the SAT, ACT proxy. And our level at the CSU is so much higher than any other state that what you have to score to do college level work and avoid remediation is so much higher than any other state that it's very, very difficult to compare. So our numbers where it looks like lots of kids going to remediation, that looks like our K-12 schools are not doing a good job, we have a lot of kids who would go into credit-bearing work in almost any other state that we consider not college ready.
Yeah, in similar kind of broad access flagships. Yeah.
Really difficult.
I agree. Yeah. I've asked, since Jessica now, former CSU person, is at the College Board, I've actually asked for her to look at this, but that, just because they use the SAT doesn't mean that they get reported back sort of what the cutoffs are. So I've been fascinated by this for a long time. And CSU did drop it a little bit, right, from 550 to 500, just in English, yeah. Yeah.
But their states is under
450, yeah, yeah.
Any other questions? Please.
I would just like to hear a little bit more about the new level. I believe that CSU is adding another EAP designation if you're college ready or not. I mean, there's 3 now, but now they're adding another one. Is that correct?
still not ready, conditionally ready.
Okay.
Aligned with level 3 and level 4 of the Smart Balance.
And then another thing is, this is what I heard at another conference. And the other thing is that how do you see a big change within the new change that was created by the CSU Chancellor's Office, as in if you don't complete a timeline of the remediation courses within your first year of your college, you're going to see your financial aid disappear. So,
Yeah, I mean, do you want to, I mean, yeah,
Provost at North
yeah.
Carolina.
Do you-
Yeah, we haven't heard that.
Yeah, I've heard, so other state, I feel like they're in general with, gosh, I don't know, 10-year trend now around performance and other things that, there's lots of conversations around this across the country with, also for taking, another way to address time to degree would be to penalize students for taking longer and things like that. But so I've heard lots of it. I haven't actually seen both the policies actually implemented, and I haven't seen evaluations of them. I will say, prior to early start, the chancellor's office did have accountability through this data system that said, if you determine that someone needs developmental ed, we want report back on whether that student has satisfied it. And I did some analysis with folks in the analytic studies office to see if, in fact, there was a huge penalty in terms of time to degree and other things. And, they take longer because, well, no surprise, they're told they have to take, additional credit. So we would expect them to take longer. But there wasn't, it otherwise didn't, they weren't implicated in any way. With early start, I don't know. I think, again, it's going to be different, whether does a campus who a student, is determined to need early start and then doesn't comply, what happens when they enter in the fall? I don't know if the campuses are going to handle that differently. What have they been doing now? So far, I don't get the sense that they've turned them away, that they have a version of still something in place for them to take as freshmen, even if they didn't like that they didn't comply, right? Is that right?
The people who don't complete that, who need remediation, don't complete that, the one who's very small.
Yeah. Great, thanks.
If there are no more questions, let's thank Michal and
Thanks.
Jake.